It looks like the FBI has identified and arrested the January 6 pipe bomber, the person who planted the devices at the Republican Democratic National Headquarters in Washington, D.C. Brian Cole is a 30-year-old man from Northern Virginia who lives some 30 minutes from the Capitol. With the few details that we know at this point, there will be a whole new set of controversies, and you can bet that most of these will be battled along partisan lines.
Pablo el Molinero.
We don't know very much about Brian Cole, and it may be that we don't learn much more for a while. The government seems to want to keep information about the suspect and their case against him under control until the trial. If it gets that far, it sounds like he might just plead guilty. I have to admit that I was on the side with those who thought it possible that it was an FBI agent or other government agent who planted the bombs. For one thing, why weren't they able to locate the person who did it? In fact, outward appearances suggested to me that there really wasn't much interest in solving that mystery. In a recent episode on this channel called Epstein Case Solved, I pointed out that public controversy could have been avoided in the case of the attack on Nancy Pelosi's husband, Paul Pelosi. My point there was that had the police simply released the body cam footage they had in their possession all along, the many conspiracies that arose from the lack of transparency could have been dispelled much sooner. However, the pipe bomb case is much more serious, and I fear we are still a long way from arriving at any consensus about it. The biggest question in my mind is why the Biden Justice Department was never able to identify Brian Cole. Here is Pam Bondi, the Attorney General of the United States, at the press conference where the announcement was made about Brian Cole's arrest.
The FBI, along with U.S. Attorney Pirro and all of our prosecutors, have worked tirelessly for months, sifting through evidence that had been sitting at the FBI with the Biden administration for 4 long years. Let me be clear, there was no new tip, there was no new witness, just good, diligent police work and prosecutorial work, working as a team along with ATF, Capitol Police, Metropolitan Police Department, and of course, the FBI.
Now here is FBI Director Kash Patel on a recent episode of Megyn Kelly's podcast explaining his point of view.
I don't know why the prior FBI didn't look at the 3 million lines of evidence. I don't know why they didn't use our cell phone capabilities and our technological capabilities at the FBI. The only thing I can come up with is either they were too incompetent in terms of leadership or intentional. And I think it was intentional because it was a further weaponization of law enforcement.
And here is another point of view from Chris Cuomo from his News Nation broadcast.
I'm glad they got the guy. I hope they can make a case beyond a reasonable doubt. I'm fine with them taking a victory lap. You should celebrate good things. It is good to get a bad guy like this if this is the right guy. I even get thanking the president. But blaming Biden? You know, there is no Trump or Biden FBI when it comes to the case agents who've been there for years. Now, I heard what they said about, oh, we brought in new eyes. I don't know that that's true. You likely had at least some of the same people working on this case now as then. Why accuse them? Well, rage bait, of course. It's not good enough to have the win. Biden needs a loss. Why? Because it's the binary nature, zero sum. The Democrats always have to be bad for Republicans to be good. It's the coin of the realm, rage bait.
Chris Cuomo then went on to play videos of Dan Bongino from his radio show and from Kash Patel on another podcast insisting that the bomber had to be an insider. Well, they were wrong, so fair point, Mr. Cuomo, but only to a certain extent. You should be glad that they followed the evidence and didn't look the other way when the evidence didn't support their political position or contradict their previous statements. It is true that they all did assign blame to the Biden Justice Department, and that is certainly a political position. But ask yourself, why didn't the FBI under Christopher Wray find Brian Cole in the 4 years that they had to look for him? According to Pam Bondi, there was no new evidence or informer that helped them solve the case. Chris Cuomo doubts that assertion. So if he's saying that they're lying, well, fine. Then we are at an impasse. But if it is true that there was nothing new in the FBI's possession to consider, then is it unfair to ask if they were distracted or perhaps spread thin because they were too busy going after everyone that happened to go into the Capitol building that day? Almost 1,600 people were charged for federal crimes by entering the Capitol, and most of those adjudicated were found to be guilty of misdemeanor charges. On January 6th, there was violence to be sure, and the FBI were right in pursuing those violent offenders. But since when does the FBI spend so much valuable time and effort looking for misdemeanor offenders? I think everyone should be able to agree that planting explosives merits more serious scrutiny than going after people for parading in the Capitol. And for many people of modest means, the cost of hiring legal representation alone would be enough to ruin their lives and possibly drive them into bankruptcy. It's an age-old tactic of law enforcement to threaten people with financial ruin in order to secure convictions. In my opinion, it's one of the more egregious flaws in our justice system. I'm sure the agents on the ground were performing their duties as ordered, but was the intent of their superiors to send a chilling message to MAGA supporters that they better not be questioning election results or they risk facing the wrath of federal authorities and the economic consequences that will surely ensue? Is it possible that the FBI intentionally avoided vigorously pursuing the pipe bomber for other, perhaps even political reasons? Remember, the position of the Biden administration was that white supremacy and their spiritual leader, Donald Trump, were to blame for everything that happened on January 6th.
In the violent, deadly insurrection on the Capitol 9 months ago, it was about white supremacy in my opinion.
They started conducting an investigation that left one team to cover the Capitol complex. So in other words, if those pipe bombs were intended to be a diversion, plainly speaking, it worked.
I know that the Department of Homeland Security had identified domestic violent extremism, violent white supremacy as the number one terror threat in the country. But were they just overwhelmed and stunned at the complexity and magnitude of the attack?
It turns out that Brian Cole is black. Don't misunderstand me. I am not saying the FBI knew that fact or that they even had any idea who Brian Cole was. I honestly don't believe they did. But could there have been concern that the person who planted the devices might not fit the description of people that the higher-ups wanted to demonize? The devices were planted at the Democratic and Republican offices. How would it have changed the narrative that white racist terrorism and Donald Trump were to blame for everything January 6th if it turned out that the bomber was just a run-of-the-mill anarchist? Also, one of the most important elements the FBI was able to identify from surveillance videos that showed the suspect walking around were the bomber's shoes, a pair of Nike Air Max Speed Turfs. It was on the FBI's wanted posters. Is it possible, and I'm just asking, is it possible that some bright guy within the Bureau asked out loud how many yeehaws of the MAGA movement walk around in $300 basketball shoes? Could that have influenced the intensity of the efforts of the agency to identify a suspect? There are still so many other questions to be answered. What was Brian Cole's motive? Reports are that under interrogation, he said he believed that the 2020 election was stolen, but his family denies that he was a Trump supporter, and he started buying parts to make a bomb in 2019, 1 year before the election. If the explosives were intended to go off the next day, why were the devices fitted with 60-minute timers? Was anyone else involved? Also, there are reports that the man might be autistic. Is that true? And how might that affect the case? The list goes on and on. I'm sorry to say to Mr. Cuomo and many others that although their protests about the feelings and statements by many Trump supporters are duly noted, it does not resolve basic questions about the federal government's behavior with respect to Donald Trump. I have defended that point of view in several previous presentations available for free on the Pablo El Molinero YouTube channel. The judicial persecution of Trump was outrageous. Even Chris Cuomo's own brother, former New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, said that some of the charges brought against Trump in that state should never have been brought. Is there an element of revenge in charging some of those responsible for the lawfare used against Trump? To be sure. But there is also a lot of very real criminality by some present and former government authorities which needs to be addressed. I have already said why I believe that James Comey should be in jail. But what about Christopher Wray? Why didn't he tell Congress when asked directly about the 275 plain plainclothes agents at the January 6th riot? Was he making a distinction between plainclothes and undercover agents? If so, does that amount to intentional deception? The distrust that half the country has in many of our government institutions is well earned. So yes, I want to know why the FBI wasn't able to find Brian Cole in the 4 years of the Biden administration, and I think we deserve the answer. Jake Tapper wrote a book where he admitted that there was a cover-up of President Joe Biden's mental decline, something that most people on the right believed all along. Well, what about the Russia collusion hoax, the Hunter Biden laptop story, the layers of lawfare used against Trump, and now the reason the FBI couldn't locate Brian Cole in 4 years? Some of our concerns, as in the case of Paul Pelosi, will be debunked, but some, like the actions of James Comey, will not. Until there is a willingness to concede that our doubts are at least legitimate, well, I just don't know what to say. Let the investigations continue, and let's all pray that the truth is exposed and that justice is done. This is Pablo El Molinero.